Larchmont Mamaroneck Local Summit, welcoming you to our last program of this season before our summer break. This morning, we'll hear from another group of Mamaroneck High School students from Joe Liberty's Civic Engagement Program, who will talk about the results of their research protecting tenants in eviction proceedings. We have a little other things going on, but I will continue. Anyway, we are happy to have them here today to talk about their research and their recommendations for action in protecting tenants in eviction proceedings. I'll now turn the program over to today's chair, Nina Cuddy. Nina?
Good morning. Thank you, Elaine, and welcome to Mr. Liberty and his wonderful students. My name is Nina Rescio, and I serve on the boards of both the Local Summit and the Community Resource Center. And in that capacity, I've come to know Mr. Liberty, the OCRA program, which stands for Original Civic Research and Action, and the wonderful students. We've had an opportunity to hear one group already, and now we have another opportunity. This program concerns the efforts of the students in support of legislation to provide counsel in eviction proceedings. So it's the right to counsel in eviction proceedings. And the background and the data shows that unrepresented tenants fare very poorly in eviction proceedings. So I will turn this over to Mr. Liberty to introduce the students and let them explain to you their work. And just point out to you that at the end of the presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. When the question and answers period begins, please raise your hand by using the icon at the bottom of the screen, and we will call on you in the order in which the hands are raised. So, Mr. Liberty, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Good morning. So my name again is Joe Liberty. I'm a social studies teacher at Mamaroneck High School, as well as the founder and director of Original Civic Research and Action, which was mentioned as a four-year program that helps students build what I call the civic capacity in order to make positive change in their community. The seniors you're about to hear from have spent the last 4 years in my program, and I'm pleased to introduce Caitlin Carpenter, Allison Hecht, and Anna McDonald, whose research and action over the last 2 years is focused on educating themselves, the public, the need for right to counsel for people facing eviction. The fourth and fifth group members, Todd Freifeld and Francis McDowell, are unable to attend due to a pre-scheduled conflict. All the students' efforts have been aided by the amazing work of many local nonprofits, such as the Community Resource Center that was mentioned already. And I want to sort of give a special thanks to their two mentors, Durandi Martinez and Janet Fry, who've just been incredible in terms of giving of their time, their knowledge, and their wisdom to help the students make progress over the last several years. Also, again, I want to acknowledge other groups such as the Westchester Right to Counsel Coalition, which again is an important partner in the students' efforts. Last but not least, I also want to thank the Larchmont Mamaroneck Summit for providing this forum to my students. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to the OCRA seniors, Caitlin, Allison, and Anna. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna screen share and Anna will kick us off. We do have obviously a presentation to show. Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you. So as it's been said, I'm here with three of my peers. We're all seniors at Mamaroneck High School, and we are all students of the Original Civics Research and Action program. And I wanted to thank everyone again for giving us this platform to share our research and our community-based action process. For a little bit of an overview of the OCRA program, which Ms. Liberty has already given, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the course. As he said, it's a four-year course at Mamaroneck High School. Through the beginning of the program, we spend most of our time conducting local community-based research within our local communities. And at the end of the second year, we try to isolate one issue that we have found to be prevalent over the past couple of years of research. And then for the rest of our time at MHS, we choose to focus exclusively on this issue and try to develop a local action plan to address this issue and execute it within the third and fourth year. And after we conducted some research, we decided to isolate the issue of the lack of legal representation among low-income tenants in eviction courts. specifically as affecting undocumented tenants and low-income tenants. To give a little bit of context for our journey, and the reason, this is one of the reasons why we decided to focus on eviction prevention and the lack of legal representation was because of this visit from the local Judge Gallagher, who works in the Village of Mamaroneck Courts. During one of our conversations with him, in which we asked him about what he tends to see in eviction proceedings, he described a scene in which he will see a landlord bring a lawyer to court. They will bring their legal representation, while he will see that being juxtaposed with a tenant bringing a baby in a stroller. And so this story for us perfectly illuminated the large power imbalance between landlords and tenants in the courtroom. And this inspired us to focus on prevention for the rest of our time working in the original Civic Research and Action Program. For a bit of an overview of the research and the data that we had collected throughout the first few years of our work, here are a few data points. Throughout this research, we found that over 90% of landlords have legal representation in eviction court, while less than 10% of tenants have legal representation, which leads to the large power balance that I mentioned earlier, in which represented landlords can often take advantage of unrepresented tenants. Often, these tenants without an attorney will lose their case in under 4 minutes. And these evictions that result of the large power imbalance and the landlord's ability to take advantage of the tenant result in obviously lots of evictions, especially for low income and undocumented tenants. These evictions can make it a lot more difficult to rent another apartment in the future. They can help ensure long-term poverty, and they can even cause psychological and generational trauma. So as we found throughout our research, the eviction crisis in Westchester County was very real, and it had very tangible effects on the most vulnerable communities. Next, I would like to pass it along to Allison, who will explain a little bit about right to counsel and contextualize the rest of our action process.
Thank you, Anna. So through all our research, we settled on the idea that guaranteeing a right to counsel through tenants through legislation was the best way to address the problem of the lack of legal representation for tenants in eviction cases. So a right to counsel is the guarantee of legal representation for tenants in eviction proceedings. So this ensures that we no longer have this imbalance in the courtroom where the vast majority of landlords have representation while tenants almost always lack representation and aren't aware of their rights. So why is right to counsel the right solution for this issue? It's the only lasting solution to this, which continues to be a growing issue. The pandemic has only exacerbated the issue of evictions, and eviction, as Anna mentioned, can be permanently harmful to any family. And so it's really important to protect tenants' basic right to housing and give them the best chance possible of staying in their homes through legal representation. Legal Services of the Hudson Valley found that tenants are twice as likely to win an eviction case and stay in their home when they have representation. So guaranteeing tenants legal representation is really a game changer in ensuring that they can stay in their home. Outside of Westchester, many cities and states have currently and in recent years passed right to counsel legislation or are currently considering it. New York City is one big example, as it's near us, and it was an early adopter of right to counsel legislation. And the program in New York City has served as a model and a teaching tool in attempts to pass right to counsel legislation in Westchester. So right to counsel is a really important and powerful solution to the issue of the lack of representation in eviction cases. So I want to talk a little bit about the release of the Stout feasibility study in New York State, which is where we got a lot of data that we're going to reference throughout the rest of this presentation. In March of 2022, a feasibility study was published that analyzed the cost benefit of right to counsel legislation in the state of New York outside of New York City, since New York City already has its own right to counsel legislation program. So this study really illuminated some really key data points that help to illuminate the importance and the need for the right to counsel. So what did this study tell us about the current state of evictions in New York State? In recent years, 42% of tenants outside of New York City do not appear in court for eviction proceedings. So these tenants lose by default because they don't come to court. And these tenants aren't coming to court because they're not educated about their rights and they don't have legal representation. So they don't know what their rights are. They don't know what steps they can take to prevent an eviction and fight to stay in their homes. So right to counsel would help all of these tenants have the representation and the education needed to be able to have their best chance of staying in their home. Currently, 95% of tenants in New York State cannot resolve eviction cases with their landlord independently without legal representation. So as Anna mentioned, oftentimes in eviction proceedings, cases are settled in less than 4 minutes, as tenants have no way to resolve the case on their own. When tenants have representation, they have a fighting chance in the courtroom. And 97% of tenants are estimated to accept legal representation if it was provided. So guaranteeing right to counsel is going to help the vast majority of tenants have the representation that they deserve, so they have the best chance possible of protecting their right to stay in their homes. So how does an eviction affect tenants, and why is it so important that we keep tenants in their homes and prevent evictions? So as Anna mentioned, evictions can have really serious and long-lasting effects, even outside the short-term effect of a tenant being evicted from their home. One thing is that eviction is obviously a leading cause of housing insecurity and homelessness. In New York City, evictions increase the probability of applying for shelter by 14%. Having an eviction in a tenant's record can also prevent the tenant from being able to secure housing, and specifically safe and habitable housing in the future, as landlords can easily access a prospective tenant's eviction history reports. A data aggregation company that gathers information like this for landlords stated that it is the policy of 99% of landlord customers in New York to reject anyone with a landlord-tenant record. So having an eviction makes it really difficult for individuals and families to find housing in the future. Eviction can also have drastic effects on mental health and physical health. Eviction-related suicides make up 1 to 2% of all suicides. Evictions can also impact children and families in a really profound way. Students are 3 times more likely to repeat a grade if they experience housing instability. And the emotional trauma and the lack of access to what we consider basic human rights and resources helps to create this cycle of generational poverty and trauma. And it's really important that evictions are prevented. And the likelihood of being laid off is 11 to 22 percentage points higher for workers who experienced an eviction. So being evicted is really a disruptive process in life, in the short term and in the long term. So it's really, really important that tenants have the best chance possible of staying in their homes and not being evicted. And the best method for eviction prevention is right to counsel, guaranteeing tenants legal representation that can help them to stay in their homes. So how does right to counsel itself prevent eviction? So as I mentioned earlier, 42% of tenants in New York State do not appear in court at all and thus lose by default. Right to counsel legislation is predicted to reduce these default rates by 32%. Legal representation obviously involves a lawyer taking a tenant and taking them to the courtroom and representing them, but right to counsel can also allow lawyers to provide legal advice to at-risk tenants and help them avoid eviction and stay in their homes as well. Without legal representation, tenants are vulnerable to being evicted on premises of lease violations they did not commit, or being looped into paying more rent than they legally owe. So having legal representation ensures that tenants can't be exploited by landlords and that they're fully aware of all of their rights. And I just want to repeat again the statistic from Legal Services of the Hudson Valley that tenants are twice as likely to win their case when represented, because that really shows the tremendous effect that representation can have in ensuring tenants stay in their homes and avoid eviction. So I want to quickly go over the current sources of free legal representation in Westchester County. So first is Legal Services of the Hudson Valley, which I mentioned. So Legal Services of the Hudson Valley is an organization that represents tenants and other individuals in a variety of civil matters. They do not serve undocumented tenants, however, and they do have an extensive intake process that may seem intimidating to some tenants. In 2021, Legal Services of the Hudson Valley represented individuals in 5,551 cases. Over 55% of these were housing cases. So they're doing a lot of work representing tenants in eviction proceedings. But unfortunately, they don't have the capacity to represent every tenant who comes to them in need. For every tenant they represent, 2 or 3 are turned away because they simply don't have the capacity. An organization that's related to Legal Services of the Hudson Valley is the Hudson Valley Justice Center. This organization serves undocumented tenants who are often at further risk of eviction and are often unaware of their legal rights and fear that eviction and appearing in court could lead to consequences due to their immigration status. However, the Hudson Valley Justice Center has a very limited capacity. So these existing organizations do really great, important work and support many low-income tenants, but they're unable to represent all the tenants at risk of eviction. And that's where the need to right to counsel comes in. So obviously, we're advocating for right to counsel because we believe that housing is a human right and tenants should have the right to the best representation possible and the best chance of staying in their homes. But right to counsel is also not only economically feasible, but will also save money over time. So when tenants are evicted, they are much more likely to experience housing insecurity and homelessness can be very costly and is a direct consequence of evictions. The statewide average annual cost in New York to provide emergency shelter of a single individual experiencing homelessness is $47,000, while the cost to provide for families is $81,700. There are also many additional costs to homelessness. However, representing tenants is much more affordable, costing only a few $1,000s while keeping tenants in their homes and preventing them from experiencing long-term housing instability. Eviction also increases the number of children in foster care, which can also be costly. So while we're advocating for eviction on a human level, while we're advocating for right to counsel on a human level, it also is economically beneficial for Westchester. I also want to mention quickly the Right to Counsel program in New York City and what we've learned from that. The initial cost analysis study conducted in New York City concluded that Right to Counsel could save New York City $320 million per year. So this is further proof of the economic benefits that Right to Counsel legislation can have. Since Right to Counsel was enacted, 84% of represented tenants in New York City were able to remain in their home. So this shows how effective right to counsel is in ensuring tenants can stay in their home once they have the legal representation that they deserve. And evictions have declined 30% in zip codes with right to counsel. So we hope the success of right to counsel legislation in New York City can serve as a model for success of right to counsel legislation in Westchester. And I'm going to pass it on to Caitlin, who's going to tell us a little bit more about how Westchester is now working towards a right to counsel.
Yeah, thank you so much, Allison. It was wonderful, obviously very thorough overview of what's happening currently with right to counsel and the state of evictions within New York State, outside of New York City, and within New York City, which of course includes Westchester. So Westchester has did several moves to address this on a local level, and so I'm going to give you kind of an update about this, and then we're going to conclude the presentation by telling you how you can take action and get involved. So first, as was recognized earlier with Mr. Liberty's intro to us, the Westchester Right to Counsel Coalition is a group of organizations that we've been working with for the past couple of years, and they're absolutely fantastic. They're made up of legal providers like the two legal providers Allison mentioned, which was Legal Services of the Hudson Valley, as well as Hudson Valley Justice Center. And then additionally, they also have community organizers such as Janet and Gertie from the Community Resource Center are super involved, and also a lot of faith leaders, because faith leaders are a critical component of this as well. And so they've been both advocating for right to counsel legislation on the county level, in addition to also working directly with the county now that we do have a piece of legislation drafted for right to counsel. Speaking of that, let's talk about the legislation. So the idea of the legislation obviously is to guarantee every single tenant within Westchester County the right to legal services within eviction proceedings. And there's various ways to go about this. And so I'm going to kind of expand on what it looks like within Westchester as of right now based on legislation's draft. But before doing that, just want to emphasize that there is broad support, not only shown through the coalition, but also shown through the series of municipal resolutions passed within our area of Westchester for this legislation. And so these municipal resolutions were passed in the village of Mamaroneck, the village of Larchmont, the town of Mamaroneck, and the village of Portchester. And if you're not familiar with municipal resolutions, what it essentially is a document that is passed by a town or village or city council or board that formally states something that the municipality would like to state, whether that is support for something like this resolution, or it is committing to doing something in the future. That is a municipal resolution. There isn't it's not legislative in the sense that it's not like a bill or a law. And it doesn't have consequence if what's within it is not fulfilled. But for this purpose, that is not exactly relevant. So here are the important clauses of the municipal resolutions that were passed in those 4 municipalities. You can see on the resolved. So within the resolutions, right, you have all the whereases and the resolves. These are the resolves. And they encourage local leaders to take steps to understand eviction proceedings. And then they also encourage the Westchester County Board of Legislators to pass legislation guaranteeing a right to counsel. So there is a groundswell of local support for this. So the legislative draft itself came out in May. It was introduced to the board by County Executive George Latimer. This is its very fancy and fun title, A Local Law Amending the Laws of Westchester County by adding a new chapter, 1987, relating to the creation of the Office of Housing Counsel. It's actually not very elegant. That was sarcastic before. However, it does its job. So what it does is that it creates the Office of Housing Counsel, which we talked about, which is then located within the Department of Social Services. And that Office of Housing Counsel is responsible for organizing a program that provides and guarantees legal services to tenants at a certain income threshold. That income threshold, which I'll talk about in a sec, is currently set at 300% of the federal poverty line, but the coalition would like that to be changed. And these legal services will be provided by organizations and qualified professionals. So what that would look like is most likely an increase of potentially funding or a passing on of this to Legal Services of the Hudson Valley, which has already been doing these, has already been representing a lot of tenants, as Allison was talking about. But through this legislation, they'd ideally have the capacity to represent more tenants. So that's the legislation draft, and there's a little screenshot of it as well. If you would like to read the full piece of legislation, we are more than happy to send it to you. We'll likely do a follow-up email with a bunch of materials for you to learn more and get more involved. So there are a few concerns with the county legislation draft that have been brought up by the coalition, so we're just going to go through those. Ideally, the timeline for this is obviously we'd love to have it pass as soon as possible, maybe even like before the end of June. But we don't want to pass it if it's not going to be passed in an effective manner. Because obviously with anything like this, right, you can say, oh yeah, let's provide them all with legal representation. But if there's not an effective means to go about doing that, it's not gonna do what it was intended to do. So there are going to be 5 concerns that we're just going to go through briefly. The first one is changing the term tenant to occupant. And there's a sentence down there. The Office of Housing Counsel will ensure that tenants, this is what's currently written in the legislation, facing eviction will be provided with professional client-centered legal representation. We'd like to change that to occupants in case tenants don't have a lease. The second one, and again, these are all from the coalition, so it's not only us, it's professionals as well. Second is increasing the income cutoff, and this is what I referenced before, from 300% of the federal poverty line to something like there exists in a different program, which would be 80% of the area median income. And this allows for more tenants to be provided with legal representation, which is always good. 3 is that it is crucial that this plan is well coordinated. And as I was talking about before, it's a very intricate thing to do, but super important that it's done well. And so the county is currently working with some providers, but we'd like for them to state this in the draft and do it in more of a profound way, working with providers and other municipalities on the implementation plan, again, just to ensure that it is done in the most effective way possible and that the people who've been doing this for decades have enough to say within this to make sure it's done effectively. And then in a similar vein to the last one, we'd also like to see organizers who are involved receive funding for their work. Again, time-intensive thing, wouldn't be nice to be paid. And then finally, 5, we'd like it to be required that the head of office does have enough experience and knowledge of landlord-tenant law in order to do this job, as it is essential for this program to run smoothly that they do have a proper background. Landlord-tenant law is another type of law, and if you're going to be running a whole program for it, it'd be great if you had a lot of experience in that. So those are the 5 main points that the coalition has brought up for the county legislation draft. And again, just to reemphasize, it is absolutely fantastic that this draft exists in the first place, that it is here and it is being considered. And we really appreciate the people at the county level who have introduced this and have voiced their support for right to counsel. And we're so excited that the county is moving in this direction. But yet again, just want to make sure that it is done in the best way possible, so as to adequately protect all of the tenants who need protecting or who need representation within these vulnerable settings of eviction court. And so now we're just going to conclude. I'm going to pass it back off to Anna to end us off with actionable steps about how you can get involved, harnessing all of the knowledge that Allison talked about in relation to right to counsel, and then all of the knowledge you just acquired on the county legislation draft, and taking some steps in order to get you involved and making sure that this becomes a reality for Westchester.
Thank you, Caitlin. Yes, so I will walk you guys through a few action steps, whether as an individual that you can take in support of right to counsel legislation or as a part of an organization. Firstly, a couple personal action items. Throughout our years, we have conducted a series of different phone banking, email banking events. And so we have many different call scripts, email scripts. One of my peers, Allison Hecht, just put the toolkit in the doc. So with that, you can either call, email, or write a letter to your local representative on our County Board of Legislators to show your support for the right to counsel legislation and your support for adding the edits that Caitlin mentioned earlier. Here you can see the different call and email scripts. It's very easy. You can just copy paste or read off, obviously including your own personal information. Secondly, I can go over a couple a couple action items that you can take part of if you are part of an organization or a faith-based community localized in Westchester. With these items, you can consider bringing your community or organization a sign-on letter to be sent to the County Board of Legislators. If they choose to sign on using this Google form that Caitlin is showing us right now, it's very simple. You just need to fill in the information and then we will take care of the rest. We will send the final copy of the sign-on letter to the Board of Legislators with all of the signatures to show the widespread support from organizations and faith-based communities in Westchester for the right to counsel legislation with the proposed edits made that we mentioned earlier. So yes, Allison has put all these documents in the chat, and we will, in the follow-up email, we will also provide these materials to all of you. Everything is very easy to do. We encourage you to take these action steps that we proposed. And now I'd like to close our presentation and open up to any questions or comments for any of the three of us.
I don't, do we see any questions in the chat, or are there any hands raised?
We have one hand raised, and I'll allow them to speak.
Sure. Thank you.
Here we go. Turn your mic on, please. Thank you.
Hi, folks. George Latimer here. And I just wanted to comment. I thought the students have done an excellent job on this issue. Very thorough. The bill that they referred to that we submitted to the Board of Legislators, I believe, has more than enough support to pass. Some of the amendments that they've proposed is what's being discussed in the Board of Legislators now. Catherine Parker, who represents us in the county legislature, is a strong supporter of this. So I do expect we'll see it pass. It ought to be a right granted at the statewide level, but if Westchester joins New York City as the second major jurisdiction, then that will help our state legislators start to persuade for a state action. And then the final comment I wanted to make is that we have budgeted sufficient money in the county budget for this year, and we anticipate sufficient next year, not just to pass the law, but to back up the funding necessary to the various organizations that would provide the legal services of Westchester. They mentioned some of these organizations, which is where the lawyers will come from. We noticed that New York City has been having some difficulty because of the volume of eviction cases. We expect the same thing to happen in Westchester, particularly in the big cities. So it will take money as well as the law itself. But good job in presenting it, and thanks for letting me just add those points.
Thank you. We really appreciate you coming on to listen and all the work that you're doing at the county.
Are there any further questions or comments?
Yeah, we have one from Ann Kodish.
Okay.
Your mic. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So I noticed that you wanted to change the term tenant to occupant. So could you kind of explain what the difference is? To me, it sounds like maybe the person staying there wasn't really the person who signed the lease, or what were you getting at there?
Yeah, that is intended. Sorry, there's an echo. That's okay. I'll keep going. That is intended to provide some tenants who don't have a lease. Everybody's situation is different. If somebody else wants to expand on that, you're more than welcome. But yeah, so that is the intention behind that. In case our tenants, everybody's situation is different, who are being evicted, but who were in a situation where they were in a place of housing but didn't have a lease for whatever reason, but they are being evicted nonetheless and aren't going to be without a home. That changing that word is able to then protect them, because or else it would exclude them.
Is there another question out there?
Don't see anyone with their hands up at the moment.
I thought I saw Larry Thal. Maybe I'm mistaken. Sorry. Elaine, your mic. You're muted, Elaine.
Okay, Larry just came on. Okay, Larry, unmute. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, no, I just typed it in as fast as I could. But this is such an excellent presentation. You guys are great. I'm so glad you've taken this up. I have a first cousin who does this type of defense work. He's a very, very good batting average, and I wanted him to attend this. But here's my question. Have any of our county fellow municipalities taken similar action? They might not have the OCRA program, but an action in public awareness and calls to action that you've made here. In other words, are you guys the beginning of this movement, or tell me how you fit in with other schools, municipalities, and parts of our county in this effort? Thanks.
So we have organized with students from across Westchester County, including students in northern Westchester and different regions, because when we've been doing some of these phone banking events we've done over the past couple of years, we've tried to get students that represent all of the different districts within Westchester County when we're contacting the Board of Legislators. But as far as municipalities taking actions, I'm not sure if any municipalities had any specific programs of their own besides the ones we reached out to, but someone else can expand.
Yeah, I think I would also add exactly what Allison just said, but to just reemphasizing the importance of the Right to Counsel Coalition, which is a county-wide coalition, and it has people from a lot of different municipalities. I know that we've talked with people from like Mount Vernon United Tenants. They're fantastic. And then Yonkers had a pilot program with Legal Services of the Hudson Valley where they did expanded legal representation there for tenants, not enough to guarantee representation within eviction proceedings, but that was still obviously a concerted effort to at least expand that legal representation and was an important building block in order to get to this point where we do have countywide legislation. Not sure, again, those are not necessarily the exact same thing as us just being advocates, because obviously none of us are attorneys or tenants' rights full-time advocates, but they are in their own right really important building blocks, again, for the countywide legislation in different parts of Westchester.
If I could just add, the students have just worked incredibly hard, doing a lot of outreach to, as I mentioned, students across Westchester County. They're able to leverage, Senator Mayer has a youth council, and she was able to have the students present at various times to the youth council to connect with students across Westchester County. And so they have really sort of leveraged their passion and their coalition building skills to try to build this again with young people across Westchester County. And like I said, I just want to sort of recognize that because it's been quite impressive what they've done there.
Sure is. Thank you very much.
Actually, I have a question for you. The county executive just told us that there is proposed legislation that requires some amending, hopefully, in the legislature. Do you know exactly where in the process the proposed legislation is? Is it in a committee? Is it getting ready for debate? Is it getting ready for a vote? And what is the anticipated schedule for when it will finally be enacted? Do you know?
Yeah, so we're unsure in terms of when it'll actually be enacted. I think the original, we had been talking with somebody, the county attorney, who originally had said a few months ago, like end of June, which would be absolutely amazing. Whether or not we're still on that schedule, we shall see. I believe it currently is in committee. Allison, if you would like to expand on this at all.
Yeah, so currently the legislators are discussing the legislation and discussing some of the potential amendments to it that we were talking about in this presentation, but hopefully they're going to settle on the final version of it and then it'll be put up to a vote. We know that a lot of the legislators are supporters of the legislation, so we're hopeful that the legislation would pass sometime this summer.
To your knowledge, as a follow-up question, has there been any organized effort by others in opposition to the legislation? For instance, perhaps an organization of either building owners or landlords? Do you know if there has been organized opposition to it?
No. At least as far as we've seen, we haven't seen organized opposition. I mean, frankly, the only outright opposition we got was in passing the Village of Portchester resolution. There was one person who was attending who came up to speak with just some concerns and questions. That is the entire extent to which our group has faced opposition. Obviously, that doesn't represent all the opposition out there, and the coalition itself might have a different story, but at least from our perspective, which again shows that this legislation, it provides a basic human right. Right. So are you going to go against providing a basic human right?
I also just want to mention that the concern that was brought up to us in Port Chester was that the legislation would potentially create an unfunded mandate, and thus the communities that are most affected by eviction would then have to shoulder a greater burden of the cost of providing representation. But as we heard George Latimer say, luckily the counties has allocated funding, so that wouldn't be the case.
Okay, we have a question from Annie McAndrews.
Hi, good morning, and to the students, a fantastic job. I would just like to make a comment, and that is, I'm on the board of an organization that provides homes for the formerly homeless, and we have an eviction situation, which is very difficult. And without the income, we cannot provide the service. Very simply, it has brought up the real need for which we provide for rent counseling before the tenants get to this situation. They have to be counseled as to how to do their part of the job. In other words, fill out the forms for Section 8, answer the phone calls from the social workers, which gets us back to the further problem of mental health. So we have a situation where one person is in a 2-bedroom that we would like to provide a family to, but we have a mental health problem, refusing to provide the information that we need in order to have the subsidy for the rent, in order for us to provide the service to her and to others. So I'd just like to bring out that point that these eviction situations are not always black and white. It would be wonderful if they were, but we run into the two situations, as I said. First of all, a lack of participation in doing their part for getting the proper subsidies, which helps us to provide the job, and then we back into the community mental health problems. So it's a tragedy when it gets to this point, but I think everything that the right to counsel and eviction proceedings is certainly necessary, but I just wanted to make the point that sometimes the landlords aren't the baddies. So thank you very much.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And as you said, right to counsel addresses one part of this issue, but the issue of evictions and of any situations of unstable housing are incredibly complex. And right to counsel does not claim to solve all of those issues.
Right to counsel can also sometimes be helpful to landlords, even because when tenants have a lawyer, the landlords and the landlord's attorney and the tenant's attorney and the tenant can all sit down and kind of create a settlement that's going to be something that the tenant can actually pay. And so landlords are sometimes able to get rent. So right to counsel isn't necessarily like a negative for landlords.
We do have another question. I think it's from Phil Oldham. I've lost my chat box. Do you want to have me read it, or would you like for Phil and Diane Oldham to read their question? What do you think? Well, I'll go ahead. The question is, as this project is the result of this senior class, will it continue in next year's OCRA program by anyone?
As of right now, we have not isolated a group of students that definitely is going to take on this project. But if this legislation passes, and if it passes with the edits we have proposed, then I mean would be the logical endpoint of the right to counsel push locally. So
there is state legislation, though.
Yes, the OCRA program typically focuses on more centralized local issues. So that could be definitely a consideration for the future of OCRA. I don't know how expansive Mr. Liberty wants to make the program, attempting statewide legislation, but as of right now, it's definitely more of a local issue because we're collecting local data and trying to help the people in our community.
Well, go ahead.
I was going to add to that with the OCRA program, these are student-driven student-driven research and student-driven initiatives. So it comes from the students. So while these 5 students, 3 of which are presenting today, are graduating this year, and as Anna mentioned, that if legislation passes at the county level, which it looks like it will, and hopefully in the form that the advocates want, they will, along with all the larger coalition, have succeeded at that point. Now I do have students who are coming up, rising sophomores and rising juniors who have interest in sort of issues connected to housing. So it's quite possible in the future that there will be other groups of focus students who pursue various pieces connected to the larger issue of affordable housing. So stay tuned.
Looks like there's another hand raised. Do you have that, Matt? Maybe not.
No, I don't see a hand raised at this moment. Oh, wait, hold on. Yes, here it comes. Okay, Annie C.
So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. This question is for Joe, I guess. I think you've given a presentation prior with the different group of kids with different issues. And so I'm just curious, because this is quite interesting that you have these. Can you give us a preview of up and coming ones that, the kids are working on now, the sophomores and juniors?
I was just about to ask that, Joe. What's
I know
on the
this is sort of
agenda?
separate from what you're asking, but I just was curious.
Sure. I mean, it might. I can definitely send out a list. Also skip any, but I'll just give you a quick sort of off the top of my head. So and just mute your computer. There you go. Thank you. So rising seniors. We have one group that, and when I say groups, they're typically around 3. This group is a little bit larger, but usually the group's around 3. So I have one group of rising seniors. They're looking at helping reduce what's known as summer slide, the loss of learning across the summer in reading and math. They're focused on initiative for reading. So they're launching that. Again, I'll give you more details later. I have a group working on reducing single-use plastics in restaurants. Right now, they're working with 4 restaurants on a pilot where they're going to eco-friendly products for 30 days. I have another group working on improving recycling in American High School, another group working on reducing food waste at the high school. I have another group working on educating and educating the public about wage theft, and then helping reduce that and increase reporting and potentially prosecution. Another group is working with basically created sort of a fundraiser mechanism to push more money towards the Hunger Task Force. Again, I can give you more details on that later. Probably skipping a group. I'm gonna feel guilty for this. I can push out that and more. I have a whole bunch of projects that are up and coming for the rising junior class. Again, many of those touch on issues of sort of inequality, environmental issues. Again, I'll put together a list and push it out to Elaine and Nina, and they can share it with a larger group. And last, I'll say I'm always looking for community mentors. So if there's some issue you're passionate about, again, my email address will be available. You can always reach out to me. And when I say mentor, it's just to give you a heads up. It's about a 2.5-year mentoring. It's not every week, but it's a long-term commitment. And Nina's served as one of my mentors, and she's done an excellent job. And again, I think it's just really rewarding work, not obviously for the students, but also for the mentors themselves.
Thank you.
I don't think we have any more questions, but I would like to turn this over to Elaine in case there are any announcements or.
We have one question from Ann Bukowski.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I didn't see it.
Go ahead, Ann.
Ann?
Ann, unmute. Oh, she somehow has disappeared. Maybe it's because it's close to 9 o'clock. I want to thank all of the participants and Joe and Nina for a wonderful morning. It's been wonderfully enlightening, and you've explained yourself so clearly and thoroughly, the engagement in the community, the research you've done, and the conclusions to the point that you're even going through the proposals and changing words to make them even more effective, make the legislation more effective. I really appreciate all that level of detail to make sure that the outcome is exactly what you had hoped. So we thank you for all your work, and Joe for the mentoring that you've done with these students as well. We wish all of them a wonderful future, leaving the high school and going on to the next wonderful phase of their lives. And I want to thank all of you for attending. Hope everybody has a wonderful summer, and we hope to see you back next fall. Many of you, not the seniors, but everybody else who's attending at the second Tuesday of September. So have a wonderful summer, and thank you again, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe. Thank you. And congratulations to you guys going on to college. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice summer.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.